You know, when a ship hits an iceberg, it sinks slowly. Everyone has time to get to lifeboats. That's what Captain Edward Smith believed. That's what every maritime officer in 1912 believed. It's what the British Board of Trade designed regulations around. That belief was about to be proved catastrophically wrong. 2 hours, 40 minutes. That's how long the RMS Titanic took to go from "we hit something small" to completely underwater. In that time, 1,504 people died. Over 1,200 were still aboard when the ship went down. But the real story isn't just about those 2 hours. It's about what happened in real time. The decisions made in the moment, the system failures as they cascaded, the human drama unfolding as the ship broke apart beneath people's feet. And when you look at the wreck, when you examine the timeline, when you cross-reference what passengers reported with what the hull structure reveals, you see something that historians missed for decades. The disaster wasn't a tragedy. It was a wake-up call that nobody heard until it was too late. This is Titanic Part 2. This is the sinking. This is the 2 hours that changed everything. April 14th, 1912. 11:40 p.m., ship's time. Most passengers aboard the Titanic were asleep. First class had retired to their luxurious cabins. Second class was in their bunks. Third class, the immigrants, were crowded into their berths, most of them exhausted from days of travel. The collision wasn't violent. That's the key detail. It wasn't a sudden impact that threw people from their beds. It was a grinding, scraping sound. A bump. Some people heard it. Many didn't. One passenger in first class woke up and looked out the window. He saw ice, chunks and pieces, on the forward well deck. He went back to sleep. But up on the bridge, Captain Edward Smith was receiving reports. "We've struck an iceberg," the lookout said. The captain went to the chart room. He found Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer from Harlan and Wolff, already investigating. Andrews was the expert. If anyone could assess the damage, it was him. What they found was the worst possible news. The starboard side of the hull had been scraped open. Not torn. Scraped. Along 300 feet of the ship's length. 6 watertight compartments were breached. Not 4. 6. At 12:05 a.m., 25 minutes after the collision, Captain Smith made the decision that would define everything that followed. He ordered the lifeboats uncovered. This was the first critical error in a cascade of errors that would doom the ship. See, the Titanic was carrying lifeboats for 1,178 people. The ship had 2,224 people aboard, passengers and crew combined. The lifeboats were designed for evacuation, but not for everyone. In the maritime thinking of 1912, that was acceptable. Ships were supposed to stay afloat long enough for rescue vessels to arrive. The lifeboats weren't for abandoning ship. They were for transferring people to rescuers. But there were no rescuers nearby. The Californian was 20 miles away with its radio turned off. The Carpathia was 58 miles away and wouldn't arrive for 4 hours. And the Titanic was going to sink in 2 hours and 40 minutes. Nobody knew that yet. At 12:25 a.m., Captain Smith gave the order to begin loading lifeboats. But there was a problem. Most passengers didn't understand they were in danger. The ship wasn't tilting. There was no list to port or starboard. The engines had stopped, but there was no sense of immediate catastrophe. So when crew members told passengers to put on life jackets and go to the boat deck, many refused. Women didn't want to leave their husbands. Passengers said, the ship is safer than a small boat in the open ocean. The Titanic was, after all, unsinkable. Everyone knew that. The first lifeboat, Lifeboat 7, left at 12:45 a.m. with only 28 people aboard. It could hold 65. Lifeboats 5, 6, and 8 all departed with empty spaces, seats that no one wanted to take because people couldn't accept that the ship was truly sinking. This was the second critical error. The evacuation happened with no sense of urgency. There was no announcement saying women and children first. There was no systematic counting of passengers. There was no communication about how many lifeboats existed or how many people were aboard. So people made individual decisions. Decisions based on incomplete information. Decisions that would cost them their lives. But the wreck tells us something crucial about this evacuation period that survivors' accounts don't fully capture. By 1 a.m., the bow of the ship had sunk so low that water was visible on the bridge deck. The ship's tilt was becoming obvious. The bow was dragging down. The stern was rising up. The water was rising compartment by compartment, exactly as the Part 1 wreck analysis showed us. By 1 a.m., 6 compartments were completely flooded. The ship had absorbed perhaps 7 million gallons of water, and people still didn't understand the timeline. Captain Smith didn't publicly announce until 1:10 a.m. that the ship had perhaps 1 hour left. By then, 5 lifeboats had already departed half empty. The wreck shows us something about this period that's crucial to understanding what happened next. The structural integrity was already compromised. The bow was so far underwater that water was flooding into compartments that the design said shouldn't flood yet. The system was failing faster than anyone realized. By 1 a.m., the situation had become unmistakably catastrophic. The stern of the ship was now visibly rising out of the water. The bow was underwater. The ship had taken on a tilt to starboard, of about 15 degrees. The propellers were now partially exposed to the air. Captain Smith made another announcement. "Be British, boys. Be British." Whether he said this or not remains disputed by historians. But what is not disputed is that he made no effort to force people into lifeboats at gunpoint. There was no martial order, no systematic evacuation. The atmosphere on deck was one of denial mixed with growing panic. An orchestra was playing on the boat deck, a detail that has entered maritime legend. They played to calm people. Some accounts say they played until the very end. Others say they stopped earlier. The wreck can't tell us what music was played or when it stopped, but the social evidence is clear. Even as the ship was clearly dying, people wanted to believe it would be saved. But the real story of this hour is told by the physics of the ship itself. Around 1:40 a.m., something critical happened. The wreck shows us this. The watertight doors, those supposedly impenetrable barriers between compartments, were failing. Water was overflowing from one compartment into the next over the top of the bulkheads, just as Part 1 explained. But more than that, some of the bulkheads themselves were failing. The weight of water on one side of the steel wall, pressing against a wall that was designed to handle water on both sides equally. That pressure was too much. The bolts holding the bulkheads started to fail. Some bulkheads buckled inward. By 2 a.m., the ship was in its death throes. The bow was now so underwater that the water was flowing across the forward well deck and up the grand staircase. The watertight door between compartments F and G, the last barrier, was still open. Water was flowing through freely. The evacuation had become chaos. The last lifeboats, boats 13, 14, and 15, were being loaded frantically. Women and children were being pulled toward the boats. Some men jumped in. Some refused to leave the ship, believing that a sinking ship would create suction that would drag swimmers under. But here's what the wreck reveals that no contemporary account could. The ship's structure was already fracturing at this point. The stress on the hull was enormous. The bow was pulling down with the weight of millions of gallons of water. The stern was rising up at an angle that the hull frame wasn't designed to handle. Hairline cracks were appearing in the welding, or rather, in the riveted seams, since welding didn't exist in 1912. The ship was literally tearing itself apart from the stress. The passengers on deck couldn't see this. They could see the ship tilting. They could see the lights flickering. Some could see water approaching. But they couldn't see the microscopic fractures in the hull that would determine whether the ship would sink or break in half. By 2:15 a.m., it was becoming clear that there were not enough lifeboats for the people still on the ship. The last boats were being loaded. Passengers who couldn't get on were trapped on a sinking ship. This is when the real horror began. At 2:15 a.m., the first distress signal had been on the air for nearly an hour. The ship's wireless operators had been frantically calling. "We have struck an iceberg. Sinking. Cannot hold out much longer." But no rescue ship was close enough. The Carpathia, steaming at full speed from 58 miles away, wouldn't arrive until 4 a.m. By then, it would be searching an empty ocean for survivors. The Titanic's bow was now completely submerged. The water was washing across the boat deck. The stern section was tilted up at an angle of approximately 45 degrees. The funnel, one of the massive smokestacks, had already fallen, crashing down onto the water and narrowly missing a lifeboat. Passengers who were still aboard were now trapped in a horrifying scenario. The bow was underwater, the stern was rising, and there was nowhere to go. Some tried to swim. Some clung to the railings. Some prayed. Some tried to climb toward the stern, following the instinct that higher ground might mean safety. But what they couldn't see was the structural failure happening inside the ship. The wreck shows us this with devastating clarity. The fracture point, the place where the ship would break in half, was developing along the line between the aft funnel and the second funnel. The hull was bending under the asymmetrical stress. The weight of water in the bow was pulling down. The buoyancy of the stern was pushing up. The hull frame was being bent like a bow. Around 2:17 a.m., something happened that survivors described, but that has only recently been understood through wreck analysis. Some passengers reported hearing a terrible noise like something tearing. That was the hull cracking. The first cracks appeared in the deck structure. The superstructure, the upper decks, the walls, the cabins, began to collapse under the stress. Rivets that had held for 10 months of service started to pop. Plates that had been welded together, or riveted in the Titanic's case, started to separate. At 2:18 a.m., the stress on the hull became too great. The ship fractured, but didn't break cleanly. Modern materials science, combined with wreck forensics, has revealed that the Titanic didn't snap like a twig. Instead, it crumpled. The superstructure collapsed. The funnel fell. The deck buckled. The ship essentially folded in on itself as it broke. The wreck, lying on the ocean floor in two main sections, with a debris field between them, proves this. The bow section and stern section didn't snap apart. They tore. The rupture created a zone of twisted steel and scattered debris that extends for 2,000 feet across the ocean floor. At 2:20 a.m., the bow section, now separated from the rest of the ship, sank rapidly. The stern section, briefly floating upright, was pulled under by the suction and buoyancy forces acting on the bow as it descended. The entire evacuation was over. 2 hours and 40 minutes after the collision, the RMS Titanic was gone. When the Titanic went down, approximately 1,500 people were still aboard. They didn't die in the ship. They died in the water. The Atlantic Ocean in April is near freezing. The water temperature that night was approximately 28 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees below the freezing point of fresh water, but salt water freezes at lower temperatures. The human body can survive in water that cold for approximately 15 minutes before hypothermia becomes fatal. Most people died within 15 minutes. The survivors in the lifeboats watched. They heard the screams. They heard the noise as the ship broke apart. They heard the sounds of humanity in its final moments, calls for help, prayers, the sound of the ocean closing over the largest ship ever built. But here's what the wreck tells us about what actually happened to those people. The wreck is scattered across the ocean floor in a debris field that extends for miles. Personal items, shoes, baggage, deck chairs, are found across a wide area. The bow section traveled so far in its descent that it came to rest 2,000 feet away from where it broke apart on the surface. The people who died didn't simply go down with the ship. When the hull fractured, many of them were trapped inside sections that were collapsing. Some were crushed. Some were drowned instantly when water flooded compartments faster than they could escape. Others made it to the ocean. They had minutes. 15 minutes of consciousness in 28-degree water. Some tried to swim to lifeboats. The lifeboats, under the command of officers who feared that dying people in the water would swamp the boats and sink them, rowed away. Only one lifeboat, Lifeboat 14, went back into the water to pick up survivors. It managed to rescue a handful of people. The others drifted until the cold stopped their hearts. By 3:30 a.m., the screaming had stopped. The ocean was silent except for the sound of lifeboats drifting in the darkness. At 4 a.m., a light appeared on the horizon. The Carpathia had arrived. But it was too late for 1,504 people. The rescue ship gathered the 705 survivors, mostly women, children, and a handful of crew members. Several first-class men had survived because officers had quietly allowed them into boats. Several first-class women had survived out of the preferential treatment given to wealthy passengers. Most third-class passengers had died, trapped behind locked gates designed to keep them separate from first-class areas, lost in the confusing lower decks of a sinking ship. The survivors were taken aboard the Carpathia. The ship's wireless immediately sent the message that would reverberate around the world. Titanic sunk. 1,500 lost. When the Carpathia arrived in New York with the survivors 4 days later, the world was in shock. The largest ship ever built had sunk. Over 1,500 people had died. The disaster dominated every newspaper front page. Telegrams spread the news around the world. Within days, investigations were announced. Within weeks, maritime law was being rewritten. The British Board of Trade, which had certified the Titanic as safe, faced public outrage. The White Star Line faced lawsuits. Captain Smith, who had gone down with the ship, was celebrated as a hero in some accounts, blamed in others. But the real consequences were systemic. Politicians began demanding safety changes. Lifeboat regulations were rewritten. Radio operators were required to maintain 24-hour watches. Ships were required to maintain safe speeds when ice was reported. And the International Convention for Safety of Life at Sea, SALAS, was established in 1913, fundamentally changing maritime law. None of these changes would have happened without the Titanic disaster. And all of them were direct responses to specific failures that the wreck would later allow us to understand in forensic detail. The wreck, sitting 4,700 meters below the surface for 73 years, preserved the evidence of what went wrong. When it was finally discovered in 1985, it provided physical proof of the engineering failures, the compartmentalization failures, the structural failures, all of which could be traced back to decisions made in the hours when the ship was sinking. The 2 hours and 40 minutes when 1,500 people died weren't random. They were the inevitable result of a cascade of errors. Design decisions made in 1909 to 1911, evacuation decisions made in 1912, regulatory decisions that were never made because they weren't anticipated. And it took the wreck to show us exactly how each error contributed to the catastrophe. 2 hours and 40 minutes. That's how long it took for the most advanced ship in the world to become a tomb. That's how long it took for 1,500 people to die. That's how long it took for an era of maritime history to end. But the story doesn't end there. Because when Robert Ballard found the Titanic wreck in 1985, he didn't find just one mystery solved. He found new mysteries emerging. And the wreck itself became evidence in some of the most intriguing conspiracy theories in maritime history. Could the ship that sank have actually been the Olympic? Could the White Star Line have switched the two ships? Could insurance fraud have led to the deaths of 1,500 people? In Titanic Part 3, we investigate these theories. We examine the evidence that conspiracy theorists cite. We compare photographs of the Olympic and Titanic. We look at the wreck and ask, is this really the Titanic, or is this proof of the greatest cover-up in maritime history? But we do it with forensic evidence. We do it with the wreck. Because in the deep ocean, for 1,700 meters down, the truth can't be hidden. The Titanic waits for us there, and it has more secrets to tell.